This is an event that we're recording now. So this is going to be the first presentation of the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon by David Barrick. And David, why don't you get started?
Okay. Let's see here. Everyone can see the slides, can see the pointer, I hope. Thank you so much, Luiz, for having me on this inaugural session of the Salon, of the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. I want to also thank at the outset here my co-author and partner in arms, John, who is zooming in from the airport, as well as my commenters today, Corey and Emmanuelle. So today, the discussion is going to be about how neural activity might explain cognition. And I'm going to present some of the heart of the view that John and I published about a month ago, as Luiz mentioned. And I'm going to maybe provide some additional details and reply to some initial objections as well. So the history of, let's see here, my slides switching? Yes, they are. The history of this paper, I think, is a nice launching point. So John and I, a couple of years ago, had a big debate about whether or not neuroscience can inform our understanding of the mind. There's lots of neural data, but does neuroscience in a novel way, in a unique way, contribute to our understanding of the mind? And I thought that, yes, how could it not? And John actually took the position of no. What neuroscience does is it confirms hypotheses that are developed and proposed in other disciplines, such as predominantly psychology, but also economics or game theory or other disciplines. In order to come to a resolution about this debate, however, we had to first ask the question of how, let's see here, is my slides not, of how could neuroscience inform our understanding of the mind? And in order to answer this question, we had to build a framework for explanations of cognition. And so my goal today is to provide an outline, a general framework for these explanations of cognition, to describe two views in cognitive neuroscience on how to explain cognition and the relationship between the brain and cognition, and to outline one way that neuroscience can be a novel source of explanations of cognition. Taking inspiration from philosophy, let's see here, things are not moving. Here we are. We first defined cognition in computational terms. So we conceptualize cognition, and I think this may be a bone of contention, as the transformation of representations to produce behavior. And in particular, we think of representation as internal states of the system that are about things in the world. Note that these representations have more sophisticated properties than have been traditionally supposed in neuroscience. They don't merely carry information about the world that helps guide behavior. For example, some of these representations can occur in the system even in the absence of their typical causes. So if you're thinking about, well, there's been a pandemic, so no one took a vacation last summer, but 2 years ago, perhaps you took a vacation, you were on an airplane. The cause of those airplane thoughts aren't necessarily going to be images of airplanes or pictures of airplanes, but rather some other thoughts within the system or some other stimuli. And so this is a property that we refer to as detachability. It's discussed in the philosophical literature. The particular properties that these representations possess beyond carrying information and helping to guide behavior are going to be determined in part by the cognitive functions that they help explain. So there's going to be more sophisticated properties, and the properties of those representations will be determined by their explanatory role. We conceptualize computation as ways of using those representations that can be described as operations on representations. For example, you might transform a representation of a goal, such as taking a vacation this summer, now that the pandemic is coming to a close, thankfully, it seems like, knock on wood, into representations that can help plan the trip, like buying an airplane ticket. So this general framework we adopted to help situate our discussion. Now, in discussions of explanations of cognition, the notion of a level appears everywhere. But what is a level, and how do we think of these levels? For our analysis, we outline two relevant senses of level. First, we distinguish different levels of explanation. We wanted to distinguish between these different levels of explanation because we're interested in the first level explainers of cognition, which will make some neural facts more relevant than other neural facts. Take, for example, the case of a broken window. Why did the window break? The window broke because the ball hit it, and this is the first level explainer. But the details in this first level explanation also require explanation. And that's where you get these second level explainers for why the window broke. It's the velocity and momentum of the ball, explain why the window broke, or similarly, the window broke because it was brittle, and that also helps explain why the window broke, and so on down through further levels of explanation. Our discussion focuses on the first level explainers of cognition. So this is the relevant level that we are assessing neuroscience's impact on the investigation of cognition. In addition to levels of explanation, we discuss levels of analysis. So we adopted Marr's analytical framework, but we made some minor changes. Notably, we think of them as levels of analysis. So each one of these Marrian levels of analysis can apply to first level explainers, second level explainers, and so on. At the ecological level, the problem facing the organism and how they might solve it are detailed. So for example, if you're an organism in the environment and you are faced with multiple options, you need to have some way of solving this problem to select one of the options. And one way to solve that problem might be to track the values of the different options or the expected values from selecting the different options, and then to choose the option that has the highest expected value. At the computational algorithmic level, the system's representations, the operations over representations that the system can perform, and the computing architecture of the system are specified. Finally, at the implementational level, the physical system that implements the computations and algorithms are also specified. And I suspect that based on some of the Twitter activity prior to the Salon, there may be some bones of contention here as well. My presentation and the paper that John and I wrote focuses on differences at two levels of analysis, the algorithmic, I'll often drop computational, and the implementational, between two views on the relationship between cognition and the brain, the Sherringtonian and the Hopfieldian. The views agree on numerous aspects of the scientific enterprise to discover the nature of mind. First, they agree on the phenomena that demand explanation, generally speaking, roughly corresponding to the set of folk psychological functions like attention, memory, decision-making, narration, and so forth. This set may need some revisions. It certainly is going to need further characterization and in particular, formalization, but the two views don't disagree on this initial set of targets. They also agree on the concepts that can be used to construct these explanations. Most obviously, they agree on the neuroanatomical concepts like a neuron or a cell or a neurotransmitter and so forth, but also on more information processing sorts of concepts like a circuit, a signal, or a code, as well as mathematically inspired concepts like networks and state spaces. So granted that they have this shared foundation that they agree on these points, how do the two views differ? The Sherringtonian view, the two views differ on the first level explainers of cognition, as I mentioned earlier, at both the algorithmic and the implementational level. So the Sherringtonian view is committed to explaining cognition as a transformation of signals by nodes in a point-to-point architecture. These nodes and connections correspond to neurons embedded in circuits and pathways in the brain. At the algorithmic level, the Sherringtonian explains cognition as a result of specific patterns of node-to-node connections where individual nodes transform representations. So the signals that get propagated down the pathways between the nodes are the representations, and the transfer functions, i.e. the functions that the nodes perform on their input to subsequently provide the output, are the transformations over those representations. At the implementational level, the Sherringtonian details neurons, circuits, and intra and extracellular pathways that implement the circuits at the algorithmic level. And you can see this, for example, in these explanations that provide details about types of neurons or, for example, specific circuits such as fear and anxiety circuits in the amygdala. Here's an example of the Sherringtonian view. To explain the ability that animals have to make perceptual decisions, neuroscientists use this random dot motion task that many here may be familiar with. Monkeys first fixate on a target on the screen, then two targets appear, followed by a centrally presented field of randomly moving dots, some fraction of which are moving in the same direction. Monkeys must determine what that direction is. They then indicate their decision about the direction of motion with an eye movement to a target in the corresponding direction. The explanation of this capacity is framed in Sherringtonian terms. So here you have the motion input into the system. There's a representation of the motion evidence, the evidence about the direction in which the dots are moving, carried by neurons in area MT. At stage one, these neurons take in this visual information and output a representation of the speed and direction of motion. At stage two, this signal is then sent along dedicated pathways to neurons in area LIP. These neurons integrate the motion evidence from area MT to form a representation of the sum of the evidence for the direction of motion. At stage three, this representation thresholds, signaling downstream action selection and initiation. A dedicated series of nodes and pathways with particular neural transfer functions like integration transforms the motion input into the behavioral response. In contrast to the Sherringtonian view, the Hopfield view is committed to representational spaces with computation cast as the transformation between or movement within those spaces. Networks of neurons and mass measures of neural activity implement those spaces and transformations. So at the algorithmic level, the Hopfieldian describes representational spaces and the way that cognitive systems move through them or transform them. The location of the system in these spaces is the representation, and the movement within or between these spaces are the transformations over representations. At the implementational level, these representational spaces and transformations are implemented in what we call neural spaces, assessed using mass measures of neural activity, such as population recordings of many neurons. And in the literature, you see these kinds of analyses and presentation done, for example, for different reaching trajectories recovered, which are represented in area PMD as trajectories in a neural space therein. As an example of the Hopfieldian view, consider this explanation of recall and recognition. Science studied this capacity using a delayed match to sample task. In the top panel here, you have a sample trial sequence for the task. Monkeys first fixate on a central square, then a sample image is shown, then there's an inter-object delay, then a second image is shown, and then you face a second delay. Monkeys are required to respond in different ways depending on the task. On the bottom left here, you see the recognition task sequence. After the second delay in the top panel, monkeys are shown a second sequence of two images. A match occurs when the second sequence of images matches the original sequence in the top panel, and the non-match condition, the second sequence fails to match the initial sequence depicted here. Monkeys must indicate whether the second sequence is a match or a non-match after being shown the test sequence. In the recall test sequence here in condition C, after the second delay in the top panel, 3 images are shown, and the animals have to select those images in the order in which they were presented in the original sequence. Here in panel B, you see that the dimensionality of the representational space is correlated with the number of neurons recorded in prefrontal cortex during this task in monkeys, and whether the trial was correct or an error. In other words, whether it was an appropriate match or non-match in the recognition task, or whether or not in the recall task, the behavioral indicated sequence was correct or incorrect. This dimensionality is a feature of the population and is not reducible to individual neurons. As a result, this explanation is simply not available to the Sherringtonian. In the left panel here, you see correct trials have a larger dimensionality, that's in this dark blue, than incorrect trials here in the light blue. across a range of different numbers of neurons that were input into the analysis to assess the dimensionality of the population. The number of neurons, as I said, is on the x-axis here, and the number of binary classifications here is on the left y-axis. The number of such classifications is the number of task conditions that a binary linear classifier can be trained to classify, such as this sequence or this sequence of images. In the right panel, you see, which has the same conventions as the left panel, except that the linear responses of each neuron have been removed before plotting only the nonlinear mixed selectivity responses. Correct trials still display an increase in dimensionality, in comparison to error trials. That difference disappears, although I have not displayed it, when only the linear components are kept. So it's the nonlinear components of the neural responses that are most important to this increase in dimensionality and to the decrease in dimensionality on error trials relative to correct trials. Here in panel C, you see that increases in dimensionality are required for basic logical operations, such as classification of task conditions, in this case, an exclusive OR rule. On the left here, you can see that a plane cannot be used to classify items, a line cannot be used to classify items according to exclusive OR if all of the points fall on the plane. But in the right panel, shifting to 3 dimensions allows for a linear classifier, in this case, a plane that's slicing the volume, to correctly classify the red from the yellow items. These differences in dimensionality of the representational space are reflected in changes in the dimensionality of the neural space, and that's why this explanation exemplifies the Hopfieldian approach. We can directly compare and contrast the 2 views. This comparison reveals the relations between them and also will allow me to address some initial objections to this categorization. First, at the algorithmic level, the Sherringtonian proposes that the abstract description of computation for cognition will consist of nodes and connections between them, with signals passed along the connections to be transformed at the nodes. In contrast, the Hopfieldian view emphasizes representational spaces. These are abstract spaces whose dimensions describe dimensions of variation in some subject matter. Take faces, for example. One dimension of variation might be the distance between the eyes. A second dimension of variation might be the distance from the tip of the nose to the bottom of the chin, and so on. Each face then occupies a particular location in that face space. The computational objects that you care about on the Hopfieldian view include the space, but also the dynamics of the system, such as the structure of the trajectories through that space over time. For the Sherringtonian, only single cells can carry representational content as a first-level explainer of cognition. The representational power of the Hopfieldian view, in contrast, is greater than the Sherringtonian because it is less committed to a particular description of the computational system, and in particular, the representations in that system, and so can permit different types of representations at the first level besides the individual nodes. Now, you might be concerned that there's a definition of node that applies to both Sherringtonian and Hopfieldian views, and so there isn't a real distinction between the 2 views on that count. Well, there is a mathematical concept of a node present in graph theory that can encompass both views. The Sherringtonian view uses a less abstract description of a node than the mathematical concept, but still one that is not at the level of implementation. It is an abstract description of a computational object. The Hopfieldian view, in contrast, does not satisfy that description at the algorithmic level. However, there is a relationship between the views in virtue of nodes. The Sherringtonian view implies a Hopfieldian one, but not vice versa. Each node in a Sherringtonian explanation can be conceptualized as a dimension of the system, and in particular, a way that the system can vary. As such, these explanations imply a Hopfieldian description, with the value along each dimension defining the location of the system in that space, where that value, for example, might be the activation level of a node. However, there may be things that are not nodes or connections that qualify as Hopfieldian, and that might underlie cognition. As a result, the Sherringtonian description implies a Hopfieldian one, but not vice versa. Turning now to implementation, there are some stark differences. The Sherringtonian focuses on types of neurons, the specific pathways between them, and other neuroanatomical details of that sort as the first level explainers of cognition. In contrast, the Hopfieldian focuses on emergent neural objects that we call neural spaces that are implemented by the spiking activity of many neurons, but also potentially by other aspects of the biophysiology of the brain. A problem for the Hopfieldian is that there are anatomically distinct areas of the brain that simply seem to have dedicated pathways between them. How can the Hopfieldian, if they're truly committed to not providing details about nodes and connections, accommodate these facts? In reply, note that the most extreme form of the Hopfieldian view, what I call and is called in the literature a total state dynamicism, where no connections or any anatomical information is included, need not be the only form of the Hopfieldian view. The Hopfieldian view might be applied, for example, piecemeal to different regions or areas of the brain at a time. And so it can accommodate some of these facts about, for example, interareal connectivity. Allow me to present a second example of the Hopfieldian view to illustrate the importance of neural spaces implemented in particular brain areas for explanations of cognition. Neural spaces contain dynamical structure in the form of trajectories through those spaces that help to explain cognition, and that simply cannot be captured on the Sherringtonian view. In this example, neural spaces help explain the estimation of temporal intervals. A representational space for time intervals is implemented by a manifold in a low-dimensional representational space embedded in a high-dimensional neural one. This space is revealed by dimensionality analysis of population recordings from the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Different sets of possible intervals, short here in red, ranging from 480 milliseconds to 800 milliseconds, long here in blue, ranging from 800 milliseconds to 1200 milliseconds, are represented by different manifolds, as you can see in this space. And the distance along the manifold represents the current trial's intervals. So there might be a trial that has, for example, an 800 millisecond interval, and those trials follow this manifold and tend to terminate around this point. The start of the trial, indicated here by ready, neural activity begins to traverse this space along one of those manifolds, with endpoint correlating with the length of the interval. This explanation appeals only to the structure of the trajectories through the state space that make up the manifolds, and eschews all details about neurons and connections. In addition, this computational means for representing trajectories is revealed by the neural data. The neuroscientific findings do not merely confirm models or explanations first formulated in other disciplines. And so I claim that I am the winner of this debate, ultimately, although John may have to defer from that. We maintain that the Hopfieldian view holds greater promise for explaining cognition than the Sherringtonian. The Hopfieldian view is more abstract than the Sherringtonian, and so covers more possible cognitive systems. If the neural basis of some cognitive phenomenon in the brain, or even in other types of physical systems, cannot be reduced to a computational description in terms of nodes and their connections, the Hopfieldian view might still be able to explain that phenomenon, but not the Sherringtonian. Secondly, the Hopfieldian view is more representationally flexible than the Sherringtonian. The Sherringtonian view assigns semantic meaning only to nodes. In other words, the nodes are the representations or the signals that are transformed by those nodes. But this is implausible for the first level explainers of cognition because it fails to allow for representations that can be composed out of the contents of many nodes, or requires as many nodes as there are possible contents of complex representations. This is a kind of semantic atomism that was discussed has been discussed before in philosophy and has run into problems that have to do with the productivity and systematicity of representations. So on the Sherringtonian view, you're not allowed to compose representations because the first level explainers are their nodes and the connections. So if you have, for example, the cat is on the mat and the cat is outside, which is a complex representation, both of which seem to contain the same semantic element of cat, there seems to be no way to capture this common semantic element across the two representations on the Sherringtonian view. The Hopfieldian view, in contrast, permits semantic meaning to be assigned to different types of computational objects besides nodes, and consequently holds more promise for explanations, representational explanations of cognition. Finally, third, the Hopfieldian view better describes recent explanations of cognitive phenomena than the Sherringtonian, as illustrated by the case of representation of intervals of time, as well as recall recognition presented earlier. There's many other such examples, and all of these recent explanations of neurocognitive phenomena rely on neurorepresentational spaces and movement within them, not on descriptions of nodes and connections. It is these sorts of features of neural activity that play a central explanatory role in cognitive behavior and that cannot be described on the Sherringtonian view. As a result, we argue that the Hopfieldian view is the most promising approach to construct an explanation of cognition. In particular, this new view on cognition describes neurofunctional properties of the brain that can directly yield insight into how cognition is to be explained, and so neuroscience can, in fact, inform our understanding of the mind. And with that, I believe, yes, I want to thank all of you for listening. I think I was well within the time limits, and most especially my co-author, partner in crime, John. Yeah, let's have a discussion. We're ready for the comments.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, David. So before we get into general questions, I think that we can, unless there's something that we want to just some major clarification that we want before we even get to debating. I'm not sure I can see all of you here simultaneously, but so I think that otherwise just unmute yourself and say, I need a clarification before we can move on. I think if we don't have that, then we can go to our discussion now. So Emmanuelle Tognoli is going to, she is a complexity neuroscientist. Oh, there was a question somewhere?
I think that Corey would be very glad to start. We can switch.
Okay. Oh, sure. So, all right. So Corey, Corey, who is a philosopher who's interested in the nature of computation and in neuroscience, is going to, Corey, is that okay with you to get started and get the discussion rolling?
Yeah, I think
so you can kind of present your take on the paper and on the presentation and on the issues at large.
Yeah, I think that Emmanuelle's comments might be a little bit more detailed. She seems to be more of an expert on some of the views than I am. So my comments are sort of general and maybe more philosophical. And yeah, I'll try to keep this to less than 8 minutes. So mostly I have some kind of questions and comments, and maybe these are easily addressed, maybe not, I'm not sure. First, I'm not sure that, well, it seemed like the way Dave characterized this idea of there being, kind of first level explainers makes it seems like there are going to be unique first level explainers to a particular kind of question. And I'm not sure that's the right way to characterize the way explanations typically work. So just using his example of, why did the baseball break the window? What counts as a first level explainer is going to depend on lots of context and interests and, what in philosophy we would call like the contrast class of, what the kind of background of in which that question is asked. So, why did the ball break the window? Well, you might think that like, why did the ball as opposed to something else break the window? Or why did the ball break the window as opposed to bouncing off the window? Or why did the ball break the window as opposed to breaking something else, right? And so, et cetera. You can kind of, think of a lot of examples there. So what counts as the first level explainer, even if you hold the question fixed, it's going to depend on the sort of background considerations. But that's a relatively minor point. The bigger point that I want to raise, I have questions about the way that, I guess I should say Dave and John, because it's their paper together. I don't quite see the distinction between, let's just take the Sherringtonian view first. I don't really see the distinction between the implementational and the algorithmic levels in that view, because they take the implementational level, I'll just kind of paraphrase their paper, are specific neural transfer functions, local circuit connections, etc. That's the implementational level. But then they take the algorithmic level to be information intake by individual cells, transformations by neural transfer functions, output to other cells, etc. Those sound really similar to me. There's a similar kind of thing about the Hopfieldian approach too. They take the elements, the implementational elements, to be neural spaces, and then the algorithmic elements are like maybe a particular subset of the neural spaces, like basins of attractions or things like that. So again, it's really not clear to me that those are meaningful differences. Now, I'm also sympathetic to the fact that in these kinds of these kinds of information processing systems, there might not be a strong distinction between what's happening implementationally and algorithmically. I think this might be a point where the Marrian view breaks down. I mean, I have my own views about, this is this holds true of kind of digital information processing systems, but not for what I take to be analog information processing systems of the type that I think the brain actually is. But that's kind of a complicated point. So I think that they might be right. But at the same time, characterizing these as, well, we have to say that there are these distinctions between what's going on implementationally and what's going on algorithmically. It's not clear to me that that's really going on. And in Dave's talk, actually, when he was showed that kind of 2x2 matrix showing the differences, in talking about the implementational level of the Hopfieldian implementational level, he mentioned neural spaces are the implementational level, but then he said the neural spaces are implemented by many spiking neurons. So the implementational level itself, he said, is implemented by something else. And so more generally, at least on the Hopfieldian view here, it's an interesting, if we take seriously this idea that we should take the implementational level on the Hopfieldian approach as these neural spaces, that's kind of a weird reification of a kind of mathematical object, because neural spaces or state spaces generally, those are our representation, our mathematical representations of what physical systems are doing, right? And it's our way of tracking very specific variations, specific physical variations in physical systems, right? And it's, of course, a really good way for us to track what's going on. But those are mathematical objects. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to reify, to think of as real mathematical or kind of objects in physics. We do that all the time when talking about, the average number of children, or, if you're bending over, your center of mass might be floating in the middle of space or something, right? So we can do that. But that's really at odds with the kind of Marrian picture here, where, Marr wanted the implementational level to be actual physical things, right? And we have actual physical things, namely neurons and their connections, right? And so ultimately, I'm just not sure that this Sherringtonian picture and the Hopfieldian picture are really at odds. I mean, it seems to me that the Sherringtonian picture is kind of focused on what I would call implementational level details, insofar as I understand it. And it's just that the what counts as the implementational levels can kind of be composed at higher levels. So I know I'm running out of time, but let me share something really quickly if I can. Let's see. Okay, so for example, okay, so here's my, hopefully you can see this little diagram. So this is in the world of digital computation. These are two images of a 2-bit adder. And so, you know, understand those inputs and outputs as voltages, right? X and Y are voltages and Z is a voltage. On the left side, we have, you know, a kind of somewhat higher level view of a 2-bit adder. On the right side, we have a lower level view of a 2-bit adder. But these are both implementational level diagrams, right? It's just the right one is more detailed, right? And we could go even more abstract and talk about the kinds of things that a 2-bit adder in an implementational level circuit does, right? Like an entire CPU, right? But we're just talking about implementational level things. It's all voltages, right? As opposed to here, this is a representational or algorithmic level diagram, right? So this is a 2-bit adder. Now, don't interpret those lines and the variables as voltages, but interpret them as ones and zeros, as bits, as representations, right? So on the left side here, we have one variable, one 2-bit variable, we have another 2-bit variable, and out comes the sum and maybe a carry digit, right? That's a kind of, you know, somewhat low level diagram, but we can decompose that into another representational level diagram, where now we have, you know, ands and or gates, but understood as, you know, ones and zeros, not voltages, but still representational level thing, right? And so this decomposition and composition, these all stay at the same kind of Marrian level. They don't move among Marrian levels, right? And so it seems to me that like I said, the Sherringtonian picture, if I understand it correctly, is kind of a lot of this stuff, right? Whereas the Hopfieldian view is more this kind of stuff, right? And the composition and decomposition can all stay within the level, but then when you move to different kind of Marrian levels, these things aren't in conflict, right? So, sorry, I'm way over time, so let me stop my sharing, and that's my kind of high level concern of what's going on here. I have other things to say, but, you know, later. All right.
Corey, I think that was excellent. I think that you said a lot that is going on in a lot of our minds, our questions that we all have as well. We're just doing this on the go, improvising here. I don't know if the best thing is to give David a minute or two to say something before his mind. You can say, you know, briefly say something, and then maybe give some time to Emmanuelle too. But
I'll be efficient. I'll be very efficient. Okay, so with regard to the initial concern about unique first level explainers, of course, I want to permit there to be contrastive elements of explanation. Perhaps you want to fix the description, and then once you fix the relevant contrastive explanatory claim, then you have these two views. An alternative concern is that, you know, even in light of contrastive considerations, it's not clear that you can explain away the differences between the views. I don't think the differences in the views can be explained away in terms of contrast. Secondly, in terms of the skepticism about distinction between implementation and algorithmic, we adopted this framework more or less wholesale from Marr, although we interpret it slightly differently. I am personally amenable to conceptualizing there as being many levels of sort of implementation, as well as many levels of algorithmic, or maybe there's just like a spectrum of abstraction or something like this. But there's no question in my mind that there simply are differences in the types of explanations that are being provided for cognitive phenomena. And the question is, how do we accommodate these differences across the two views? And we think that the computational architecture, wherever that ends up falling out, is going to be different across the two views. And as I said in the talk, it is the case that the Hopfieldian algorithmic description is more abstract than the Sherringtonian one, and the Sherringtonian one, in fact, implies a Hopfieldian one. Thirdly, the relationship, the details about implementation. So implementation could also have many levels. but I think we have a strong disagreement here. So neural spiking implements neural spaces, but it need not. There may be other aspects of the biophysiology of the brain that implements these neural spaces. And I do take these to be real neural objects. So you said that this is just our mathematical representation, and I'm kind of arguing for a good reification from a mathematical description to a theoretical object that I think should be on the same neural anatomical grounds as neurons and axons and so forth. So this is a strong claim. And finally, if the Marrian framework faces these repeated challenges, maybe we should revise or do away with the Marrian framework, but that won't change the fact that you do have these two distinct views on the relationship between cognition and the brain as inferred from actual cases of explanation of cognitive phenomena.
Luiz, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go.
Yeah,
John.
I think that the point that Corey made about there seeming to be something very close implementationally and algorithmically to the Sherringtonian view is precisely the reason the Sherringtonian view is so attractive to neuroscientists, because the abstraction algorithmically is still easily relatable back to neurons and their connections. So for example, we say in the paper, the half center model for CPGs, the neural integrator for saccadic eye movements, the reciprocal inhibition for the stretch reflex. It's precisely because the abstractive step, the algorithmic step, is so easily relatable back to neurons and their connections that neuroscience is in love with that program. It's precisely because they seem to be so close to each other. But what David and I are saying is that you're not going to have that intuitive crutch when it comes to thinking, where you're going to be able to think back to the sequential activation of connected neurons with a slight abstraction or gloss on that and get to thinking. That's precisely the point we're making, Corey.
Thank you, John. I think that summarizes really well how neuroscientists really think. I mean, that proximity is really so enticing that they almost can never let it go. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But we should give Emmanuelle some time to also present or discuss her points.
So I wanted to try to do 4 points today. And my first point will be to try to rescue Sherrington away from the Sherringtonian view, because I think that his very early thinking shows interest in collective behavior and spatially distributed processing, which is lost in this piece here. My second discussion will be about the dimensionality of behavioral manifold. I would like also, if I manage to get there, to try to discuss the reconciliation between mass actions and flows, which are, in my view, important aspects underlying the distinction between those two views, yet to be named, in my opinion, and the organization across scales. So on collective behavior, those are the Silliman lecture that Sherrington gave in 1906 in Yale University. He was not very happy about it, but I think this is a very, very interesting fundamental book. So he's talking about the enormous neural superstructure possessing million-sided connection and with the potentialities for association. So I think that the one-to-one neuron and connections embody the best he could do at this time, but does not embody his intention and certainly not his thinking about how the brain works. So this is probably taken here from lecture 10, sensual fusion, which is an extremely interesting piece. The second argument I want to do is that he went a little bit further, talking about the notion of time, which I would like Corey to bring back at the end in a few slides. And he said pure conjunction in time without necessarily cerebral conjunction in space lies at the root of the solution to the problem of a unity of mind. The third thinking Let me add also that Sherrington obviously has a lineage of thinking that is overtly assumed by Walter Freeman, Errol Bazar, Steve Bresler, and myself, and many others. Of course, I only named here the people whom I have the certainty of their interest. Number 3, this is about representations. I'm sorry, I have technical difficulties here. He said that object experientially regarded as single object excite neural reaction that has starting point in many spatially and qualitatively distinct receptive points. The commencement of what he called those nervous arcs, which are being redefined as re-entry loops, microcircuits, etc., etc. And he talked about the distance that is between the stimulation and the stimulus, the puppet. He talks about puppet and actions in the mind that are not immediately due to stimulus. And finally, on fields, he has this thinking about a neural machinery towards working. They are adjunct, and he's talking about the connection between the reflex and the central nervous systems lie not confined in the nervous arc, but in field of nervous apparatus that lie in the cerebral hemisphere. So from this point, I would like to say that you define Sherrington on one hand and Hopfield on the other hand. You did very, very meticulous and clear vision about what those realities entail. But I would like to say that there's many overlapping realities that can be associated if we ask the audience to put different names on what you define as view 1 and view 2. Many people would come with different definitions. And those definitions, to me, I would oppose that the Sherringtonian view as a good route in Sherrington, and I would like to take Sherrington away from it. And I would like to say that this view on lower dimensional manifolds and the neural state space would be probably in a contemporary sense very, very fondly regarded by Sherrington. So my next point would be to talk a little bit through elements in the paper that are, I think, very well understood, but that quick reading may lead to unclarities. So in some sense, and I think this is the Rigotti study in 2003, you try to articulate the view that bigger state spaces are better. And you can obviously code much more information with a state space with 100 variables or 10 variables than with one with 2. Which is the little picture that has been taken. But a very important aspect, which is in the following of Haken synergetic, is that if you don't collapse or minimize those degrees of freedom, you cannot not have an effective behavior. And so an effective behavior, provided a fixed system, hinges on how low dimensional it managed to establish itself, so that it can be more efficient. And I thought that this aspect was a little bit dangerously glossed over in the paper. I'm sure it's very clear, but I was afraid that some of the reader would not capture all the subtleties. And I bring here a French philosopher, which magnificent book is still not translated in English. It's called Between Crystal and Smoke. And this is a book where articulation of order and disorder is set as a non-monotonous, non-linear function that you see here, with too much disorder and too much order both being low dimensional and not amenable to adaptation and life. So crystal too orderly and smoke too disorderly, and the optimum between in those non-linear functions. And I thought that a non-linear view on the manifold was very, very important to bring. And so there's a few follow-up work in the manifold literature that I noted down here. And I don't know if I have a few more seconds. I wanted to discuss also about the view of propagation at the micro scales where we can have flow but not mass actions, a strict view where you have synchronization but you cannot have flow. And I wanted to discuss that the former provides non-reconfigurable modularity in space. So those are all the theory of pontifical cells by James Graham over cells, the centers in neuropsychology. and strict decomposability in time, sequentiality. But in the real brain, we are sitting somewhere more in the middle here in this dark area, where we have a little bit of both. And to reconcile them, we need to have models for the emergence of spatial-temporal scale. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this mathematical model where this happens, where you have a simultaneous expression of long embedding shorter and shorter and shorter time scales. And you have the simultaneous contraction or expansion in space. So you have both movement of space-time, which are continuously modulated to create manifestation, which sometimes can reach global activity in the system or shrinks and can last very long or can be very, very brief, which I think are essential for cognition. And that's it.
Well, I think there's a lot to digest there, and we have a few minutes. I mean, we can continue here as long as people want to stay on. But I think that your first summary on the Sherringtonian notions, I'm not a great I haven't read Sherrington in a lot of detail, but it was really amazing to read those notions that I never associated with him, to be honest. And so I think that we all need to do our homework and separate at least the early versus late or something that merits changing the term Sherringtonian perhaps in the framework. But David, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, could you react to some of the points and then maybe we can open it up for some discussion more broadly?
Yeah, so Emmanuelle, thank you so much for those comments, which opened my eyes to areas of research that I was formerly not aware of, which I find to be tremendously helpful. Historical differences, people have taken issue in the past few weeks with labeling Hopfield a Hopfieldian. It turns out that maybe Sherrington is not a Sherringtonian. These labels were labels that we chose. Actually, the labels predate the paper writing. They were labels that we chose just in conversation to highlight the two views. And it's entirely fair to claim that Sherrington was not much of a Sherringtonian. Secondly, I think there are some really interesting questions about exactly how you get the right kind of mesh between the facts on the ground about how the brain works and these kinds of state space analyses. And I think that's an open aspect of the Hopfield type research program. So you were talking about how to get spatial temporal scales and loci that are in this dark area in the plot that you depicted. And I think that is a super interesting question and ties into some other things I'm working on, but also in my presentation where I briefly mentioned that there's a total state dynamicism where you just throw out all of the connection details and a ton of the anatomy, and you really conceptualize the brain as just this massive high dimensional system, and you don't care where you're recording your neurons from, you just record all the neurons. And there's actually some really cool work, although I'm not sure if it has yielded explanatory payoffs yet, from thousands or tens of thousands even of neurons being recorded. I'm thinking of like the Stringer et al. In Nature papers from 2019 and 2020. And I think that's like, there are people, Hopfieldians, who are like, yeah, record from every neuron and then do a total state analysis of the brain. And I'm not sure that's going to give us the kind of hold that we want for an explanation of cognition. I do believe different parts of the brain do different things. I think that is a fact about the brain. And so insofar as that is antithetical to the Hopfieldian urge, we're going to have to relinquish this pure Hopfieldianism and bring in some details. And I tried to illustrate that by showing how you can still get a Hopfield type explanation, even if you just look at population activity within a particular brain area. And then there's going to be some theory about how these areas communicate with each other. But so I think that what you've really done is you've pointed me towards some novel literature here that is trying to ask these questions, maybe not in those terms, but I think that actually is quite reconciliable with the research enterprise. So I'm really grateful for that.
Can I just say one thing about that, about Sherrington?
Go ahead.
I'm very aware of what Sherrington said, that his approach wasn't touching, but let's be very clear about what we were trying to say, which was that there is But Sherrington pragmatically started with the stretch reflex in the soleus muscle of the decerebrate cat for the reason, because he thought it was tractable. Same as David Robinson, who I was lucky enough to get to know, who looked at the brainstem. It's not that neither Sherrington nor Robinson or others didn't realize there was more to it, but they had no research program for it. And the research program they did advocate for was the kind of connection-based Sherringtonianism that David and I talked about. So yes, they could philosophize all they wanted, but they had no idea how to do it in a research program, and they left it for later. And I would say that was the road not taken until the Hopfieldian approach.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so it's 1 o'clock. I wanted to have the chance to engage others here, because one of the goals is really to start our conversation here and not just become a subset of experts talking to each other, but having more broad discussions at all levels. So for those of you who are still on the call, please, I think there's a lot of questions. There's some questions on the chat, but if you can unmute yourself and ask the question, maybe turn on your camera, that would be great. If not, we can try to go through the chat box. Are there any questions? Anyone who wants to ask a question? I guess no.
Luiz, could I pop in?
Yes, by all means. Yes, please.
Hi. Sorry, so my reception was good in and out in the mountains in the west of Ireland, so I apologize if I missed anything. And I thank you for inviting us to pop in who don't maybe have a grounding in the literature for what's been discussed, but it's been fascinating. What I wanted to ask was just from a biochemistry and neuroimaging point of view of my own, is it not possible that the physical elements that meet the first Sherringtonian part of the discussion are not in some ways possible mechanistic underpinnings of the second? What I mean by that is that there are discrete elements in the environment that we interpret possibly at the neuronal level with smaller node representations, but then there's something that I wouldn't say is a physical thing, if you don't mind me saying, David, but is more of an event where the relationship between two entities that are discrete from the environment are interpreted. So the cat and something else may be quite discrete, but the relationship between the two, when we get to that level of thought, that then it becomes an event rather than a physical thing, for the communication between the input. And so I think of this as inputs and then thoughts that are relational between the two, which I think are events rather than a physical underpinning. And then you move to inference. And so to me, it seemed like the base level interpretation of simple things in the environment, and unfortunately, quite like all the cognitive tests that we use in psychiatry, are different to the thoughts that we have when we interpret the relationship between elements, and that those are events rather than maybe than physical. But again, you know, this is without a philosophy reading background, and is a little bit more from a biochemistry neuroimaging point of view.
I appreciate that question. So I think I have a two-part response. All of these objects are physical objects, and I would consider an event a physical event. I think events are physical. So the release of neurotransmitter at the synapse, for example, that's a physical event. And I consider these kinds of neural spaces that are part and parcel of the Hopfieldian view to also be physical. So none of this is meant to be non-physical, or and I don't. Maybe what you meant by physical in this case, you meant something static or enduring or something like this.
Yeah, anatomical versus physiology. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Sure. But I think both views are going to require dynamic processes in the brain. There is no static explanation of these types of cognitive processes. But secondly, I think that a lot of the details about connectivity will, no question, actually, in my mind, explain the Hopfieldian spaces. The problem is they won't be the first level explainers. So this is where the first, second, and third levels become important. It's not that anatomical details are utterly irrelevant. It's that their target of explanation is not the cognitive phenomenon itself. It's the neural space. It's the presence of these neural objects. And that's what's going to provide, and that's where their explanatory power is going to come. But if we're focused on explaining the cognitive phenomenon, the argument is that we're going to have more success, and we are having more success by appealing to the elements of Hopfieldian explanations.
Thank you.
Emmanuelle, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, I wanted to add in the Sherringtonian view one element. For instance, in the Mazurek study that you presented, one element that you had not insisted, which I think is fundamental, is this little ribbon about the definition of task, which has its roots obviously in psychology, in philosophy, and in cognitive science. But what I think both the Hopfieldian quote quote and the Sherringtonian quote quote try to do is to stitch those two dual realities. What are the function and what are the brain doing during the function in a time course? And this is why I was trying to bring back time, because you're talking about neural space, and I want to think of the significance of neural space-time. So one, for instance, very simple example that comes quickly to mind when you think about how the brain helps you to understand better this long tradition of millennia of philosophy about the function of the mind is, for instance, the buried chef potential. Before you look in the brain and you see this long preparatory activity, seconds before the initiation of the movement, you don't know the time frame or the details. So you will see here an example of neural activity feeding insight into a brain. I have a second example, if I may. I'm currently working on oscillation at 600 Hertz, lasting just a few milliseconds in the somatosensory system. And those, obviously, they are way too short to have permeated into a philosophical view with names. And what do we do with all those unnamed activities? Those that the tradition of language, Wittgenstein, the tradition of philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, don't know how to pin a label on. And they are there, and we are still not managing to push them out because they escape the time frames of words, language, introspection, phenomenology.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. Are there other questions or other points that people would like to suggest for discussion?
Luiz,
David,
can I jump in?
I'm sorry, I saw David Jones first. I mean, I'm sorry if I saw his hand first and it wasn't physically the first, maybe.
So thank you. This is excellent. Thank you for giving us the opportunity. I just wanted to give a little bit about perspective from a clinical perspective on what diseases of cognition teach us about these different models. And just to give a very concrete example, I see patients who may have temporal lobectomies. The entire portion of their anterior temporal lobe may be removed. They don't have the same symptoms as someone who I just saw the other day who had a degenerative diseases of that same brain area, where the entire function of that brain region was gone. Her semantic knowledge had disappeared. We're talking about 9/11. She asked me, what's a terrorist attack? And whereas someone who has an anterior temporal lobectomy, they know what a terrorist attack is. They have no problem with that. And the reason why is because the mechanism at which those functions went away, even though you removed all the tissue in both cases, one was a degenerative attack, and I think you actually need a state space or more Hopfieldian explanation of that, versus the other, you actually just remove the tissue, yet the function remains. And so that kind of makes that point of these different levels of explanation, its dependence on the implementation. As a behavioral neurologist, I think it's becoming quite clear to me we need something other than a Sherringtonian model to explain brain damage in these cases.
Thanks, David. David, do you want to comment?
Yeah. So I actually think, so that was a nice example. There's some really beautiful work on OCD and from a Hopfieldian perspective, and characterizing the role of anterior cingulate cortex in OCD as having these repetitive behaviors, for example, that the system is unable to seize, and modeling that as a dynamical system with a well attractor where the energy barrier is too high for the system to boost out of. And that's like a state space basin of attraction where the system just can't boost out of this, this neural state that's giving rise to these repetitive behaviors. And that's work by, there's actually two models, dynamical systems theoretic models of the ACC and OCD, one by Ed Rolls at Oxford and one by, I think, Tiago Maia, I forget where he is. And so I think I really like that, the example you gave. I like this example of OCD because I think the Hopfieldian perspective, as I implied during my talk, is really productive as a research program. And it's not just productive from the experimental side of things, from a pure science side of things, it's also clinically productive. It's giving us new insight into how we might conceptualize particular psychiatric dysfunction and potentially to pave ways for addressing that dysfunction. So I think that was a really nice example.
I would just like to say that I think it's profoundly correct that psychiatry has not succumbed or been able to yield the way neurology did. And the Sherringtonian approach to psychiatry has been almost uniformly a disaster. And so I think you are absolutely right that we need another framework for psychiatric conditions in contrast to neurological ones. So I think that's a really good point, and I agree with that.
Yeah, I think Corey also wanted to follow up. Corey?
Yeah, I think that relates to one of the more general things that I wanted to say, Dave. Now I know that you're not totally committed to the Marrian view, but I do want to say that one of the nice things about Marr's idea is that, none of the levels is the explanatory level. Like, set aside the stuff I said earlier about, contrast classes and all that. Marr said, to have a full explanation, you got to have what you called an explanation at the ecological level, at the algorithmic representational level, and the implementational level, right? And I think that's totally true. Like, if I can do this thing here where, like, I'm turning off my camera, right? And one explanation for that is I'm moving my cursor and putting it on an icon, right? And there's the program. That's a perfectly fine explanation in one sense. But we also might want to talk about the circuits, right? If there is a hardware problem with my camera, then we're going to have to talk about something in a different level of explanation. And when it comes to, I think, talking about issues in clinical neuroscience or neuropsychology, that brings that kind of point up really well, right? Because although in general, I don't think there are problems with making strong analogies between what brains and minds do and what computers do. But, oftentimes when something goes wrong, it's not clear whether the right place to look is at the kind of software level or at the hardware level. And there's, a nice idea in computer science of this idea of leaky abstractions, right? Because sometimes what looks like a problem at the software level is really at the hardware level, right? And so, the broader point is just, you keep saying the explanation of cognition, the first level explainers are going to be at this kind of, neural space level. And, maybe on one view of what it is to explain cognition, that could be right. But, in the whole kind of Marrian picture, you're going to need all of these levels. Right.
So real quick to jump in there, it's about the first level, the levels of explanation outline of an analysis that we provide, where there's first level, second level, et cetera, explainers. Each one of those levels, to fill it in completely, needs to be analyzed at all of the three Marrian levels. There is no mapping from the levels of explanation onto the Marrian levels. These are meant to be orthogonal distinctions. So that was a miscommunication. Okay. So I agree with you. In other words, I agree with you. You need to fill in all those details just at the first level. So a first level explainer of a cognitive phenomenon is going to involve a formal specification of the problem facing the organism, a formal specification of the solution to that problem and why that mathematical model solves the problem facing the organism. That's your ecological level. There's going to be a computational specification of the elements and representations and architecture. And then there's going to be a specification of the implementation, and it's all going to be for that first level explainer.
Okay, there's more to say, but I'll shut up.
I think Amal had a question earlier. I'm sorry if I didn't catch your hand earlier, but if it's still...
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. So I'm a little bit puzzled by the dichotomy that's being presented. Let me start with the first level explainer of cognitive phenomena. I think the two levels or two approaches might work better for different cognitive phenomena. So if we consider something really low level, like a looming behavior in crickets, there's a single visual neuron that detects looming predators and jumps off. That's a cognitive phenomena that could be.
Actually, I don't think it's a cognitive phenomenon. That's part of the claim that we're making, is that cognition really is more sophisticated than these kind of stimulus-bound responses that guide behavior. Okay. And that's an important point. And do I think crickets can cognize? Maybe, but it's not going to be in the highly canalized.
We get into a really big problem, which is every time that we go study some of these behaviors that are supposed to be really simple, we find out, okay, let's forget crickets for a second, but we find out that in species X that was thought to be like crickets, it's way more complex, more context dependent, more flexible, less innate, and so on and so forth. So I think what happens is that if we come up with using these terms, we're always categorizing things like, okay, it's cognition here, it's not cognition there. And I mean, maybe there is some level of high level language, something or other that is qualitatively different. But for a broad spectrum of cognition, I think that we really trap ourselves into distinguishing between these different sectors. Okay, this is low level, automatic, conserved, so on and so forth. And this is high level, mammalian or primate or human only, and so on.
Yeah. So I think that's a nice point. So actually what I prefer to do is start with like the cognitive phenomenon, like attention or memory or emotional processing, whatever it is, give a nice formal definition of that, and then look at and see how that's going to be implemented. Also, I'll admit that it could be the case that there are certain functions that might be better explained on a Sherringtonian view. Certainly when you're looking at some of the stimulus response functions, it's going to be the case that these are better explained on the Sherringtonian view. Also, we like to think of, John and I sometimes talk about like a sensory motor phenomenon or the sensory motor periphery, and that's really Sherringtonian. And actually the Sherringtonian view, the Sherringtonian way of explaining those kinds of phenomena has made great progress. It's when you get to these more, and it's hard to cash this out, so I'm going to have to be a little hand wavy, these more sophisticated instances of cognition, thinking about narration or imagination, creativity, planning, decision-making, and some types, and so on, that you start to need representations that have more sophisticated properties. You start to need computations over those representations, transformations over those representations that can do more sophisticated things. And that's where we think the Hopfieldian is going to have the greatest impact.
But then you really need to define what your domain is, because if you're excluding so much, because then for instance, attention, you have to exclude attention, because attention, there's very sophisticated forms of attention across all the vertebrates. So you could say, oh, I don't mean this kind of attention. I mean this, like my ability to pay attention to something that I recollected in the past, if it was related to something that I was planning in the future, I don't know what. So I think that you're going to have to exclude so much that I think that you're going to start talking about some theoretical framework that is of interest to a really much smaller subset of neuroscientists, because a lot of us neuroscientists are interested in a lot of basic things that, not the cricket, perhaps the cricket is a little too basic, I don't know, but I think there's an enormity of phenomena there that are way more complex than a really super basic, very low level reflex like type of circuit.
But Luis, what you're doing is I just wanted to say one thing is you're conflating complexity, cognition, and intelligence. No one is denying that you can have intelligence. As Daniel Dennett points out very well, you can have a lot of competence without comprehension.
John, I never conflated anything, so I didn't conflate something.
What I'm saying is that you can have, you said complexity. What I'm saying is that comprehension and cognition are not synonymous with complexity. And you said, oh, that we're studying more complex systems. Complexity and cognition are not synonyms.
No, I was not. I was just saying that then you have to define the target more clearly in the paper, because the way you phrased it was, it seemed to me, maybe there was my misreading, it was applying to a lot of things that neuroscientists are interested in. So all I'm saying is that no matter, it's not a matter of being right or wrong, it's a matter of what is the target of your, so are we talking about a subset of things or almost everything, or that's all I'm saying.
Intentionality.
Okay, but that's,
I would say it will be intentionality mainly.
Okay,
those things which have semantics,
right, that's fair, John,
intentionality.
but that's not how the paper was described though, right? I mean, at least at an explicit level, it seemed to be like, if we just look at, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm attributing more to the paper than it was meant, which is something that can often happen. But you were talking about, for instance, you were talking about, well, I can say that David just mentioned attention, right? So he mentioned attention. Decision-making is so vague that it includes a lot of things, right? So his decision-making is very broad. So, but anyway, I don't want to steer the discussion too much, and it's not my role here. Jonathan,
may I
you have a point that you wanted to?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I wanted to actually get to the other point that I was trying to say, that I don't really see the dichotomy necessarily here. It's possible, in my view, that the Sherringtonian view is a local view. Consider a hierarchical system. It's a local view, and individual neurons, individual nodes at the local level, they're important individually. Their connections between each other are important. But at the same time, if you take a top-down view, then on a receptive field, now you're not really concerned about individual neurons that you're looking at downstream in your receptive field, but you're looking at aggregate patterns. So now you're looking at the state space. So it feels like they're just two views of the same system.
Well, there's certainly two different ways of describing neural circuits in the brain. And the question is, what kinds of details, neural details? And this is in the talk I mentioned that they agree on the neuroanatomical concepts. We don't have a case here of a clash of paradigms, for example, where there's a set of concepts and terms being used by the Sherringtonian that the Hopfieldian just doesn't use and can't understand. They have a shared lingo, they have a shared set of tools, methods, and in particular mathematical concepts as well. The question is, what are the relevant neural facts for explaining cognition? And our goal was to highlight that there is a kind of a rich tradition in neuroscience of appealing to specific neuron types and nodes and connections, but there is a more recent but increasingly rich and productive research program that appeals to these other types of neural facts. And we wanted to systematize and describe these competing views.
Jonathan, you had something that you wanted to contribute? Maybe you can unmute yourself. You're still muted. We can't hear you. I mean, although it says unmuted, but it's the mic is not. Yeah, too bad.
Representational level or implementational level problem?
It's all a mishmash anyways, right? Isn't that the takeaway?
I'm having trouble trying to pay attention to the screen in the chat. So if there's something in the chat that we want to catch up to, would you mind saying it on the mic, speaking it, or if you want, okay. So if there are any final points that we want to discuss?
I'd just like to make one more point about, this is Dave Jones, about the, so we keep talking about really are these two views of the same thing, and does that really matter? And this is, it gets to the heart at a debate going on in the neurodegenerative literature. It has these different views have different mechanisms of explanation for consciousness or cognition. They also have different explanations for diseases of those states, which has consequences for how you would treat them and how you understand. And so right now, a view of most neurodegenerative diseases is that misfolded proteins are spreading along connections, a very Sherringtonian explanation for these observations. But there's an alternative explanation, which is the ones that I'm trying to put forward, which is that there's degeneration of modes of function, which is much more Hopfieldian. And they're very different explanations, and they have different treatments. So how you actually solve those conditions and make patients feel better, these two viewpoints offer very different suggestions on how to do that. So there's very practical considerations.
It's interesting because the first kind of explanation that you were mentioning is almost irresistible to neuroscientists, right? It's almost inescapable because that's the language that they're trained and they think of their lives, all their lives. So it's very difficult to bring the focus to another perspective, I think. But I think that, I mean, my hope is that with newer techniques that we're faced with recording over multiple scales and multiple units and multiple time scales and so on, it will shift the type of narrative and description that neuroscientists themselves have to engage in, almost by necessity, because we really, you know, if our goal is to measure everything in the brain, you know, every atom in the brain, every particle in the brain, and then we can't all say it's just a matter of atoms. We have to now start organizing the way we discuss things. And so I think that the technological advances that we're experiencing faster and faster, I think might in some sense push us to a different level of explanation that might connect much more to Hopfieldian or other kinds of views that are along that general class. But I mean, just some random thought here that occurred to me. Okay, so if are there any other final questions or comments?
I just want to say really quickly, as a philosopher, I'm really happy to see neuroscientists taking philosophy to be useful to trying to set up some frameworks for clarifying things and maybe understanding things. To me, that's a step in the right direction. And at the same time, I'm happy to see philosophers taking the time to try to get the neuroscience right and figuring out what neuroscientists are actually doing. So this is a productive exchange, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of us feel the same. So I think that whatever ways that we can promote this dialogue and obviously we all have our millions of talks already that we have to go to and attend and activities. I wonder how is it going to be back to in-person living life when we also have online. I'm not sure exactly how life is going to work, multiplexing those two, but I think we have a lot of things going on, but I think that continuing this kind of debate would be, I think, interesting to a lot of us, and I think beneficial for both general fields. Yeah.
And thank you, Luiz, for setting this up and providing the stimulus for this pathway to be excited.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So let's see if we can continue. So that would be the actual measure of the enterprise. Okay, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.